yeah, let me open it up for a conversation. Let's just popcorn and see where we go.
Thanks, Don.
Thanks.
Hey, this is Karanbir. That was a wonderful presentation. Thank you so much. Some
Thank you.
really relevant, necessary ideas that need to be shared more. It's I'm wondering though that we understand that teachers need to make a shift uh, in attitude and the skills that they're bringing into schools.
Yes.
Are you are there any things that you're aware of, any courses that help teachers make that shift, or
Hmm. Um,
or
I
have the courses that are available, are they adapting to this required change?
so it's a tricky thing because um, there are aspects. So I'm a member of and involved with a variety of things, including the Rights-Centric group that has just recently started. But there's things like Education Reimagined and I'm trying to think of some others. What schools could be. They have the right ideas, but they haven't really landed on something that's really making a big difference. Like they haven't actually the agency piece. There's a lot of attention going to the word agency these days. I don't know if anybody else has noticed it, but obviously if that's something I'm using, I'm trying to pay attention to it and see it everywhere. And so there's a variety of things going in the right direction, but none of them have really landed on the like to say there's a course. Well, I'm working on it. But I'm not aware of any like teacher education things that actually do that well. Now that's only partly true. The what I would say is the closest to that is there's an organization whose name is escaping, Agile Learning Centers. Okay, so the Agile Learning folks, the place I think I got the most actual like training in it was participating in they have a summer institute kind of thing that they do. I went down to Rock Tree Sky in California, and basically what they do is they take a few days to say, this is what we're going to do. And the great thing about the Agile thing is that you're actually doing it while you're talking about it. So they're actually using the tools as they sort of explain to you why these tools are important. And then we spend like if you that's the 3 day like institute part, and then you have like I think it was 5 days, 4 or 5 days of like you take the weekend and then you have a bunch of kids come, and then you just do it. You do it. So it's not it's a small organization, global but small. And so they haven't gotten wide acceptance, and it's a rare training opportunity. So, but that one is actually doing the thing independent of how they talk about it. So they aren't talking. They don't use the word agency in their stuff. I don't think they might have adopted it since, but when I was doing it, that wasn't the language that we were. I forget exactly what the emphasis was, but it was really about agency, even if the practices were supporting agency, even if they weren't talking about it using that language. So that's the challenge. That's why I had to write books, is because there isn't stuff out there doing it, to this degree. And the reason this presentation emphasizes precision is because part of what makes my work different from many other people who've come before me, because there's over 100 years of people writing books like mine, in the sense that we want to talk about freedom. A.S. Neal's stuff from Summerhill, and even before that, some other people. There's some good stuff out there, but there wasn't a scientific foundation until now, and that's self-determination theory, and that's why I have laser focused on the self-determination theory, because that's the scientific basis for talking about agency in a sensible way. A way that is actually connected to how human beings are in the world, independent of how we want to talk about them, or how we are thinking about it. Is I'm solidly in the scientific worldview, in the sense that I know that human beings are individually delusional, all of us, all the time. The question is, how much delusion, how connected to reality are we or not? And I know that our institutions, when they're organized well, are the only access we really have to reality. Now, that doesn't mean institutions are infallible. That means that institutions have to be structured in very specific ways to mitigate all those delusional tendencies. Now, we happen to have figured out a practice for that before we had a way to talk about, a variety of the ways it shows up. But science was one of those things where it's like, oh, actually, if we want to get a solid grasp on causality, turns out we're individually very bad at figuring that out. But when we collectively organize in a very specific way, then we can get better at it. And we have multiple institutions, not just science, but also jurisprudence, journalism, and academically respectable history are kind of 4 main institutions for access to reality. And so because I believe in that, it's like, okay, we need a basis in that in order to enact an actual paradigm change. And I have a whole presentation that I did at Summerhill a couple of years ago, which you can see online, that talks about how change kind of needs to happen paradigm-wise. Okay, so I open it up again. I hope that answered your question. Let's go to Wendy.
Thank you. Brilliant to be here. I'm really loving this conversation. Thank you. The self-determination theory, when I first came across this, it was one of the very first things that I put as a question on LinkedIn, was, what am I missing? What is wrong with this? Why are we not hearing about it?
Yeah.
Because everything, after I'd read about it, and I've got the handbook, and the more I read about it, the more it seemed all roads lead to Desi and Ryan.
Agreed.
But nobody's talking about it, and then I ended up thinking, because I'm a mature student, I'm studying education, have been for the last 7 years, and I was, well, is it too controversial to just say we don't want to encourage agency amongst all children? And which going back then through the history of why we have education and the different purposes of education, it's very complex, and there are different people that want different things, and even parents want their children to fit into society. So even parents want a little bit of social conditioning to happen so that their children don't think it's acceptable to do handstands in the middle of Sainsbury's. Right. Whatever.
Okay, so
thank you.
I'm also a member of the Center for Self-Determination Theory, and there's a whole cohort of people who are meeting later today, in fact, coincidentally, and that's the topic, is why isn't this more widely adopted? Now, I also recently saw there was an analysis of the top 12 education journals, and Edward Deci and Richard Ryan, the founders of self-determination theory, are the top cited people in education journals for the since 1988. Or 1988 to 2021 or something like that. And so they seem to be in that technical discourse. Now, this is part of the challenge, is that there's a difference between, as I pointed out, a technical discourse, which is exactly what self-determination theory has been, developed in and is really good at. But it's not a political discourse. It's not even a marketing discourse, and not even by a stretch of the imagination. And so part of what the challenge is as much as it is good, and it is there is also increasing awareness of it. There's a recent book called The Disengaged Teen, which I recently read and responded to, and it's like fantastic. It's really getting into finally presenting in a good solid form the agentic piece of that. So there's an aspect of engagement is called agentic engagement, which is from the self-determination theory framework. So it is talking about agency in that sense. And so the challenge is not, is it out there? Because it actually is. It's just you can't see it because nobody's marketing it, or few people are marketing it. It's starting to come into that language now. Like the disengaged gene is far more of a marketing language book than it is a technical language book. It's written by a journalist and a researcher. And so the journalist really, I mean, it's a nice thick book full of stories about how this is being done and how it's interesting. So that's an interesting piece of it. I think it is out there. It needs more of that marketing language, and I think we also need to think in terms of policy language, and Back to Basics 2.0 is my proposal in that, which is perfectly consistent with the CRC as an example. Let's go to Sifaan here.
I just wanted to add in something to Wendy's question.
Mm-hmm.
And so if you look at how education policy is made, every country or every state in the US, they have a bunch of policymakers. Mm-hmm. And actually most people who talk about education, the education should be this and education should be that, are talking about education for other people.
Yeah.
Hardly anybody is talking about education for themselves. So when we have many children in schools, nobody really cares what they want because the policymakers are like, we know what you want. And it's pretty much the same story even in higher education. And by the time you get to the position of making policy, you're sort of at the tail end of your career and not so much interested in your education anyway. So for self-determination theory to be really happening, then the people who are receiving the education need to be in the driving seat on the decisions about the education, which doesn't happen anywhere in the world really at mass scale. Like you have like Agile Learning Centre, Sudbury is like niche operations, but not at large scale.
Yeah, the closest to that would be Israel because of Yaakov Heck's work there. But even that, it's an interesting conversation to talk about whether that's actually, how thoroughly that's actually happening. In his own book, he talked about how one of the principals eventually was like, I have to quit and do this because I'm done with the dog and pony show, because they were doing a dog and pony show. So the phrase dog and pony show means putting on an act to show that you're doing the thing you're supposed to be doing, and then you go back to whatever you're doing on a regular day-to-day basis. They put on a dog and pony show for Yaakov to say that they were doing democratic education. Just like democratic education people, I've heard the story in Germany where they have to put on the dog and pony show of having adults in control in order to keep the German authorities off their backs. So you can have dog and pony shows on both sides of like, yeah, we say we're doing democratic education, but on a day-to-day basis, not really. Or you can say we're doing regular education, but on a regular basis, we're actually giving kids the choice. So part of the thing about assessing engagement and things like that is that we need to be able to look below that surface, to look below just the dog and pony show and say, oh, let's actually get some real data around whether the kids are engaged on a day-to-day basis or not. We can actually do that in ways that get at that without necessarily, in a scientific or respectable way. You have anonymous surveys and things like that where you can actually get at that and find out more about that. Great. Je'anna?
Hi, thanks, Don. It's really great having this conversation. I wanted to also pick up on, sorry, I can't see much on my phone. Was it Wendy who was saying about not wanting your child to do backflips in Sainsbury's? Because I think that this is actually a very important point. Because if you look at some of the writing that's been done, looking at why adults are so frightened of giving children agency, we see that when kids have got their autonomy quite suppressed, they don't have a lot of that need met, it becomes sort of quite pressing that they have it met. And if they can't get it met in a positive way, then it sort of bubbles up and explodes out where it shouldn't. And then that's what adults see. And then they think, if we give this child more autonomy, more agency, we're going to see more of this kind of intrusive behavior, Whereas when we actually give the children opportunity to be agentic on a daily, regular basis, they actually learn to be responsible with their freedom, which is where, if you look at sort of the grandparent philosophers of this approach, you get statements like A.S. Neal, freedom, not license, freedom and responsibility being flip sides of a coin. So what we actually literally see is the children who've grown up having their core needs really well met, at home as well as in their educational spaces. You just don't see this this thing that everybody thinks is universal for teenagers. You don't see this toxic teenage rebellion going on. We don't find it. It's like the Riverstone teenagers. They kind of can't understand why all the school teens are wanting to just get drunk and steal the family car and smoke, and because it's not good for you. But if you've always been reined in, you mustn't do this, you mustn't do that, this is not good for you, it becomes that the only way you can have a sense of autonomy is to rebel in some way, do something you've been forbidden to do. So the problem is that we've got this kind of vicious cycle in that because pretty much all the kids, the majority of kids, are having those core needs not that well met, especially in their schools, even if they're being met at home, then you get these behaviors that make the adults think that this is a dangerous direction when actually it's exactly the right medicine.
Right. That's actually a really important point. I agree. And if you look at items 1.2a and 1.3a, it talks about how needs are met. And I started with the physiological needs because there's an important analog there between physiological and psychological needs. Some physiological needs can be met at home and don't have to be met at school if the parents can, like food, parents can send food with children. They can send it from, support that need from home, and the school may not have to provide it. Some places that's just daily reality. Ideally, it doesn't have to be that way, but because of the possibility exists. In psychological needs, we recognize that except for the smallest children, sleep is a need that is regarded as something done at home. You don't sleep at school. So it's parallel in that sense. But the psychological needs for autonomy, competence, and relatedness, as self-determination theory has shown, they must be done in real time, like air. So the idea that parents could supply the need or support the need for air from home is so ridiculous, it's never been done. Nobody suggests a self-contained breathing apparatus to provide good quality air for children, or teachers for that matter. It's never done because it's extremely impractical and it would look ridiculous. But the need is there. There's a school here in Portland, Oregon that had I'm part of my political career included being a co-founder of a organization that works on air pollution in Portland, Oregon, USA, and that we literally identified a school that had such bad air quality that both indoors and out that the district has now decided to move the entire school. No one suggested ever that we provide self-contained breathing apparatus for children and teachers there. We did put air filters literally in the classroom, and actually that was part of the data that made the point, was that when you put air filters in there and actually remove those toxic pollutants, it proved that there was a problem. And rather than provide self-contained breathing apparatus, they moved the entire school, which is itself a massive expense, but it's more practical than trying to do it a different way. So that's an important analogy, is that needs are of a characteristic that we have to satisfy the needs in real time in school. The need for autonomy in particular, but autonomy and relatedness. So talking about the kids who's doing the back, because part of the reason that kids use freedom responsibly is because they have relationships that they care about within that situation. The reason that kids will do the disruptive stuff is because they don't have a connected relatedness that has them understand that the impacts they're having are disruptive. They have the inclination they're going to do it. If they don't see it as a negative impact on others, then of course they're going to do it. But when they're in a situation in which they can observe and see or have the feedback about the disruption that it causes, then they say, oh, well, I don't need to do that right now. I'll do it some other time, or I'll do it some other place, or whatever. So understanding needs is actually really important in there. And that's part of why it's a paradigm shift, is because part of the Basics 1.0 idea is that adults simply have power and should have power and should exercise that power for the good of the children, independent of whether children think so or not. And it relies on the logic of infants are literally cannot know what is good for them in certain ways. Okay? So we have to, when they're a toddler, protect them from, as soon as they start walking, we literally have to physically intervene to protect them from traffic. Like, we have to make sure they cannot possibly know that running out into the middle of the street is dangerous. So we have to literally take physical control of them. But then we're infantilizing kids from then on. If in schools, we deny them the opportunity to actually exercise judgment, to actually develop an identity that says, in my culture, people know about traffic, and so I won't endanger myself randomly. That doesn't mean that youthful exuberance won't get in the way sometimes, but that's the point. Is like, you have to have a context in which that is constantly reinforced as like, hey, that wasn't a very responsible way to, like running out in the street. Can you have a conversation, and you build that identity, you build those skills to be able to see the situation better. There's a variety of things that go with that. So yes, Je'anna, thank you so much for reinforcing. We have to think about the context in which these things are happening, and understand how they're going. Back to Karanbir.
Thanks, John. Just
here, Don.
Excellent.
And so it all is so much common sense. Everything you say rings true. Everything everybody else has said here rings true. The problem that I'm trying to deal with is how do we end up so invisible? How do we get beyond that? And so we're not just talking amongst ourselves. We're actually out there making a difference. And obviously we have to pull together in some way to make that happen. One thing that has really registered with me this morning, Karanbir and I were on an earlier event today, by the Teachers Lab, and they were presenting some really interesting projects that teachers are doing. And so that if teachers have enough flexibility, they can do some really neat stuff.
Yes.
And what I'm thinking is that with environments like Dileepa, Sifaan, and Je'anna have created with Kinder Republic and Riverstone Village, those environments have the flexibility for teachers to really go at these interesting projects that would engage young people.
Yep.
And so with these democratic learning environments that have been created by a lot of people now,
right.
They could be kind of monitoring what teachers are doing in the regular school system that are innovative, and kind of demonstrating how much easier they are to implement in an environment like a democratic school.
Mm-hmm.
And so that could be a way that we could make some ground on this. Just before I get off here,
Yep.
Put in chat the link to the Declaration on Child Rights-Centered Education.
Oh, good.
The more that we can get people signing on to that, the more we will have the numbers, the more we can help to hold people together.
Yep.
And so that's one way that we can really start to come together and encourage people to work on this idea of pulling education more into alignment with human rights, which
Yep.
is all about agency.
Exactly. Awesome. So let me go back to the pedagogy versus hoitagogy question, and then we'll circle back. And just briefly before I do that, I have interviewed a number of about 30 interviews of people who run mostly democratic schools, talking about how when you put agency at the center, it really makes a big difference. And you can actually hear from some of the teenagers Je'anna was referring to in my interview with them. So that's called Agentic Schools, which you can find it through my webpage. There's a tools, I think it's under the tools tab. Anyway, encourage that. So let me jump back to hoitagogy versus pedagogy. So I recently was, someone on LinkedIn is a huge fan of hoitagogy. He's a guy in Texas. And so he keeps coming back with, his conception of pedagogy appears to be like, pedagogy is this toxic thing that is harmful to children, and hoitagogy is the answer, and so we should go to hoitagogy. I don't see it that way. In Manifesto, I kind of really dive deeply into that, and you can see it in the Back to Basics 2.0, is because if educators are inherently given the care of children, and they have an in loco parentis responsibility, then doing psychological harm to them is literally not pedagogy. If well-being facilitates learning, then if you're doing something that diminishes their well-being, you're defeating the purpose of pedagogy. That's literally cannot be the case. Okay? So, the hoitagogy thing, if my favorite kind of version of that is a fella, oh shoot, now I'm going to remember, anyway, I have the book over here, who really went into it and developed this set of principles and, like core things, and, it was really cool. Every single one of the recommendations, like, I don't see how it's not pedagogy. I literally cannot find any meaningful distinction between pedagogy and hoitagogy at all. Like, I have not heard anybody make a case that in terms of how children learn and how adults learn, I have not heard anybody can make any convincing statement that doesn't mean the same, like come down to the same principles. And the reason for that is, in order for me to be convinced that there's a difference between hoitagogy and pedagogy, is you have to tell me there's something about being a child that's fundamentally different from being an adult, other than size and experience. Of course, children are smaller. Duh, isn't that obvious? And so, yeah, if they're going to be comfortable in a classroom, you might need smaller furniture. Like that's not a pedagogical, that should not be considered pedagogy. That's just taking care of them, like ensuring that they have the well-being they need to learn. Like, duh, isn't that dead obvious? They're less experienced. Duh, hello. If I were to try to study physics, you don't start me at quantum physics. I'm naive to physics. I don't have experience of physics. And so, I have direct experience, but I don't have an experience of the academics of physics. I need to be taken through a process to get to the point where I understand what you're talking about when you put up that formula for motion. I don't understand it, it's just, or whatever. It's dead obvious that children are less experienced. So is everybody else about something. So explain to me the difference between being a child and being an adult. If the primary human needs for adults and children are the same, which all evidence points to that being true, the needs for autonomy, competence, and relatedness, and those are the primary psychological needs. There's a secondary psychological need called beneficence, which means it has the good stuff but none of the bad stuff. And so if you can convince me that there's something about being a child that is, and their learning, that is truly distinct from whatever is explained by the facilitation of well-being and learning through primary need support, great, I'll listen. But so far, I've never heard anybody make a convincing case that children are any different from adults in terms of needs and learning. So pedagogy is a useless term. It's all pedagogy, because what you're talking about is pedagogy is fundamentally take an inexperienced person, get them to a level of competence in a field. That's what pedagogy is. That's what pedagogy is. The two terms are it's a useless distinction. It makes no difference. Now, the reason it came about is because we didn't have that knowledge and understanding when people were writing about it in the early 2000s. They weren't thinking self-determination theory. They weren't thinking about agency. They were thinking schools operate in a certain way. Schools are pedagogy. Schools for children necessarily are defined by pedagogy. And so all those things must be pedagogical. They weren't pedagogical choices. They were culturally based power choices that had nothing to do with how children are. Nothing. And so the distinction is meaningless. And if Back to Basics 2.0 is, it makes that case. There's nothing in there. Everything I talk about in Back to Basics 2.0, not a single reference to being a child. There's nothing about children in there. Well, I mean, I think I use the term children, but that's because I'm simply, using K-12 primary and secondary school as my context, and so I might refer to. I can't remember now. I refer to students. I don't think I refer to children. Although the in loco parentis, I do refer to that. And so, but I never use the word child, I don't think. I'm looking through it again going, oh, did I? And so it's true of students independent of, like, if we think about institutions of learning for adults, usually university, right? Colleges, universities. What are the characteristics there? Like, we give them a lot of agency. They get to choose their program. Now, there are constraints on that because if you're pursuing a degree, you have a list of things you have to do in order to get the degree. You don't have complete freedom there. You said, this is the degree I want to pursue, therefore I'm choosing to kowtow to these requirements. You're literally going to bow before them and supplicate yourself to those requirements. And that is an autonomously motivated thing. Okay? That is fine. And children can make those choices too. So, I want to briefly mention, since Je'anna was bringing up, one of the things I did in 2011 and 12 was I studied two schools that are, one is a self-identified democratic school called the Village Free School, and I studied another local program called the Village Home Education Resource Center. So they do not identify as a democratic school. However, their operations are, they offer a slate of classes. They have a catalog full of opportunities for kids, and they get to self-select what they want to take. The program imposes no requirements in terms of academics, or anything else for that matter. If you come, you pay, you take some classes, and you go home. Your parents are responsible for you when you're not directly in charge, being put in charge of an adult in front of a classroom. And so that is an environment where I found that they maintain the intrinsic motivation of their students. So those kids have chosen courses to take. They supplicate themselves before those requirements that instructor makes. Now, one thing about that is that I asked several teachers who had experience in both traditional environments and regular and this alternative environment. I said, well, what's the difference? And one of them was very specific. She was a very traditional math teacher. In fact, she was against homeschooling when she was a mainstream teacher. And then she was, after she retired, she was recruited to teach here, and she was like, oh, okay, I'll try that. And she was completely flabbergasted to discover that homeschoolers are really cool kids. So professionally, what was the difference between what she did in her mainstream class and what she did here? She said nothing. Except she was treated as a professional. In other words, she got to make decisions about what to do and what to require and how to work with the kids. And two, she had a much more diverse group of ages within her classes because the kids were self-selecting into them. And so for her, it wasn't teaching that was different. It was the context of being trusted as a teacher that made the difference. And so that's, I think, that's the shift we need to make. And that's another reason it's a paradigm shift, is literally the relationship between the teacher and the institution also needs to be consistent with the same principles. Is the teachers need to be respected, given autonomy, encouraged to develop relationships that are meaningful to them and their students, and a relationship where there's a teacher, a student, and the subject as a third element in that. And that's where I've adapted the stuff I was talking about, this guy who studied pedagogy. I took his analysis of he came up, I think it was 5 or 6, I think it's 6 different kind of ways that teaching happens. Actually, I think it's 5. I said, okay, what they're describing is each different, what he called a different way of teaching was just an emphasis on, if there's 3 elements, then if you emphasize this relationship, you get one kind of teaching. If in I'm making a triangle here, so you have the teacher, or let's put teacher, student, and subject. Okay. Well, if you emphasize this one, you get one kind of teaching. If you emphasize this relationship, you get a different kind of teaching. If you emphasize this, you get a different one. And then there's different variations on that to give you the 2 other ones, which is sort of like, well, what if you emphasize kind of these 2, or there was 2 other. Oh, what if you emphasize the whole, or what if you emphasize where they overlap? And so it's 5. It's 5 elements, 5 different kind of fundamental approaches to teaching was what he wrote about. And it's like, yeah, okay, when you understand it that way, if you emphasize kind of the whole, there's 2 different ways to emphasize the whole. The actual, like emphasize the outer thing, or you can emphasize the negative space that creates it. Anyway, but that's where, when in one of my books, it's actually in the manifesto, which is here, I talk about that and say, okay, well, those are the different styles of teaching that you can have, and delivery of content is one of those things. It's emphasizing the relationship between the teacher and the subject and saying, I'm an expert in this relationship. Let me bring you along to how this relationship works, and let me help you understand the delusions you might have about this subject and your relationship to it. Anyway, so Richard, you had a hand up.
Thanks, Don. The idea of courses, Daniel Greenberg has dealt with that with Sudbury Valley School, and they're just a normal part of a self-directed learning environment. It's like exactly. Peter Gray's idea of the library model as opposed to the public school model, where people go into the library, and if there's a course being offered that interests them, they'll take advantage of it. Yep. And it's the autonomy that they have to follow the things of interest to them. So the courses are there, certainly. Yep. What I want to emphasize is terminology is really important, the little messages that we can get out. And the Learning Planet Institute is really bringing the idea of local learning ecosystems to light. They're using that term. And I think it's a really useful term, because that's, to me, what the 2 groups I've mentioned here already, Kinder Republic and Riverstone Village, are essentially doing. They're providing an environment that has the potential, an early prototype perhaps, of what a local learning ecosystem is all about, using the entire community, Yakovech's idea of the education cities, that idea. And if we use that as our terminology more than democratic, self-directed schools. But we start to get the public, I think, imagining something really rich, and cultivating that. There's another way that Derry Hannum in an earlier festival event presented things that I think is really useful too, that we might be able to build into our messaging. And that is, he visited a place not far from him that is allowing various species to live in healthy environments. And he pointed out how species of their own volition will survive really nicely according to what their life is if they're left alone in that environment. We're not trying to train them. It's human beings that we're trying to train and mold, and that's where we're going wrong. So with what Derry was saying, the more examples that we can have of all these various species who thrive in environments that are right for them, we can better make the case that we just need to provide environments where young people can thrive if they have autonomy. And that again is the potential that we have as early prototypes with Kinder Republic and Riverstone Village and all sorts of others. We need to get that out there. So how do we manage our messaging to get more people involved? Because people on this call, the ones I know, which are most of you, we don't need to be talking to each other anymore. We've got to get this show on the road. And how do we do that?
Okay, so a couple things. Education Reimagined, I think, was probably an early champion of that learning ecosystems viewpoint. So that's something that there's a signature part of their work as well. I don't know if they originated it or not, but anyway, I mean, there's that ecosystems point of view thing, I think, is a valuable perspective, and I think a really great way to think about it. And I think as someone who really has taken on kind of evolutionary thinking as a way of trying to understand what's going on, I think that having a plausible evolutionary explanation for how human beings are is crucially important, and that's actually at least one of the criteria for identifying a primary human need, is that it has to have a evolutionary plausible role in well-being. And autonomy, competence, and relatedness were developed not out of DC and Ryan didn't just say, oh, let's just didn't de novo come up with this idea. They actually were drawing on extensive research and other terms and things that had gone before. And so when they decided on those, what they were doing was drawing on a whole host of research and saying, oh, okay, these seem like the most plausible things. So in a sense, they are totally standing on the shoulders of giants. They didn't just generate this out of nothing. They just put it together in a very specific way. And then I think one of the crucial things they did was they said there has to be clear criteria for inclusion in what counts as a need. And so this is the work that was the reason that like Maslow's hierarchy and a variety of other needs models just don't even come up to snuff is because they never developed a clear way to decide, how can this framework and understanding be grown or changed, or how can we incorporate new information? And one of the ways you do that is you develop criteria that say, okay, is this criteria meaningful such that like if the key thing decisions they made was developing criteria and using well-being as the outcome that matters. A need has to be related to well-being, otherwise it's not a need. And so that's one of the ways that you distinguish something is when you talk about self-realization. That is a useless term from a scientific perspective. It might be great for other kinds of conversation, but it is not something you can talk about in a scientific way and say, here's a measure that we can use, here we can see whether it's present or not. In fact, people have tried over and over again to redefine Maslow's terms and try to make it work. It doesn't work. I have a piece on my website about how Maslow was wrong. Let's get rid of it and move on basically to SDT. So that was one thing. Richard, speaking to something you said earlier, I'll get to you, Leif, in a moment. I do recognize that you're there, that you have your hand up. A thing you said earlier about keeping an eye on interesting things in the mainstream. There is a project, an organization called Transcend is doing this project where they have a database of schools that are literally in the deeper learning space. So deeper learning is a phrase you need to pay attention to because the Carnegie Foundation is funded this project. I believe they were, anyway, I'm not sure what the funding is, but I know Carnegie is also was in this realm for a while. I think they've actually moved on to other things, but deeper learning is a context that they have this database called the Canopy that lists schools under, there's a whole list of like something like 19 different possible things they could be listed under. One of them is agency, student agency, I believe. And it's like, oh, okay. I'm one of my intentions once I get to the idea of doing a third season of my Agentic Schools interviews is I'm going to use that database to identify schools who are not in my usual realm of personal contact with, and approach them for interviews and say, hey, how do you support agency? What does this mean when you are in this database as a supporting agency? So there are resources we can use to reach out to more mainstream schools and find out what they're doing. Public schools mainly is in the Transcend. I think they might have a few private schools, but it's mainly yes. That Joyce was just handing me a note. Okay, so there are resources for that, for making those connections to more mainstream schools, finding out what opportunities they are utilizing, how they're actually operating within their constraints. They're different from ours. Okay. And
Don, can I just jump in for a minute here? Reinforcing what you're saying there about deep learning. There's a person who was dean of a noted faculty of education here in Canada, who has gone on to really press that deep learning idea, and he has this book, Michael Fullan. I think I've mentioned that to you before.
Yeah,
and that's one of the things that would help us bridge the way you're saying.
Yep.
And so I just want to put that in. And Leif, sorry for cutting in on you.
Yeah, no, if you don't have it, get Michael Fullan's best book was written with Andy Hargreaves, and it's called Professional Capital. If you don't have it, get it, because what he did was he described self-determination theory without reference to it. So he described how, and what I did in my work is I said, okay, professional capital is the adult conversation. How do we talk about teachers and supporting their needs? Let's talk about professional capital using their specific model, because it was entirely developed within mainstream thinking. And then our conversation here is the playfulness and how do we generate playfulness. So that's Back to Basics 2.0 is a child-centered conversation, but a professional capital-centered conversation is the way we talk about teacher development and things like that, to be able to translate to a more mainstream framework. Let's go to Leif, since he's been so patient and waiting. And Leif or Leif? Let us know.
Hi, yeah, it's Leif, like a leaf on the tree.
Cool.
Good morning, everybody. I thank you so much about speaking to this is like such a exciting topic to me, and I appreciate everything that we've talked about so far. Because I'm a facilitator at the Village Free School.
Oh, okay.
And I also was a student at the Village Homeschool in Portland.
Nice.
A youth. So it's been interesting seeing these different like methodologies in these different schools that are both supporting like self-directed education, but in distinctly different ways. And also seeing now on the side of like a facilitator in one of those schools, the ways that parents also play into that dynamic that's happening at the school. Because not only do we have to bring along, like students are on board with this stuff,
right?
But like educators are oftentimes like the ones that we need to educate about these norms and about these values and these principles to be able to apply them in schools. And then there's like administration that we have to speak to with like the professional like speak about like how to talk about self-determination theory without talking about self-determination theory, right, like in terms that make sense to administrations and stuff. And then there's also the parents, who are the people who actually have the agency and the power to bring their children to the spaces that we create and that we facilitate for self-directed learning, and for agentic schools, for Back to Basics 2.0, all these different models that we're trying to do to support agency in schools. And one, I'm really curious about how we bring along parents and how we communicate to parents about what we're doing, and support, like, honestly, there's a conversation of like parent agency in this too, of like how we're supporting youth agency, how we're also supporting parents and having agency in this conversation. Because there's we talk a lot as facilitators of the Village Free School about like how we all, like, this is like our favorite job in the world. We do it for our whole lives, but like the parents are often the hardest part of this job, of like when you get into conflict with a parent about the methodology you're using at school, about when there's conflict about parents don't feel like the things that you're doing with the way that you're making decisions, or the way that you're facilitating activities, or the way that you're engaging with screens at school, like actually support student agency and autonomy. And that's a really hard conversation to have. So I appreciate this, like, this approach that like says the quiet parts out loud, that is less vague. I feel like in the vagueness is where these conversations happen, is when like we speak with all these lofty terms that sometimes we kind of joke about how it feels like we're a cult, but we're not a cult because we don't force people to stay, and we let people make their own decisions about what we're doing. But like when that kind of that language gets called into question by parents, they're like, be specific though. What are you doing? What is the impact? Like, are kids actually being taken care of in these specific ways that you say they are? And that makes me think of how you were talking about pedagogy and hoidagogy, about like it's actually the same thing and it's not necessarily bad. It makes me think about the conversation about assessment in self-directed education, about how there's this like turn away completely from like, hey, testing is like not helping us actually support kids, so let's not do testing at all. But then in that space, there is still important like information that we can gather from our student body and from our parent body and from our community of schools that can help us to determine how best to move forward and what decisions to make, and how to support well-being and agency in schools. So I'm really curious to see how this like document and the manifesto and stuff about agentic schooling and basic Back to Basics 2.0 can be applied to that assessment conversation, that communication conversation to parents, to help us have more effective conversations together, and to help us get out of the butting heads we are in conflict place to a more collaborative place. Because this has just been like the thing that's been really grating at me for the last couple of years as a facilitator. That's like pushing me to like think about like maybe getting into a different career, or like taking a break from educating. Is like there's this problem that comes up time and time again, and it burns out our educators and it burns out parents from being okay with their kids being in these spaces. And I feel like we need to figure this out, because it's also getting in the way of us communicating to people who are not already on board and bringing people in to this movement.
So let me. So first of all,
those are just some thoughts that were coming up.
Okay. Yes. So on the assessment piece, I have a tool that can be used. It's called Instant Climate. If you go into the Tools tab on Holistic Equity and you go down there, that is designed to be a tool for assessment of a learning space. It's probably more useful in like literally a course, but it could be used anyway. It's an assessment of need satisfaction. Currently, it's focused on need satisfaction. It's designed to eventually also be capable of using SDT items to assess patterns of motivation and depth of engagement. Oh, and actually, you can have like learners assess the support that's being provided by a teacher, or a staff could assess the support being provided by a principal or whoever is supervising them. Because it's a human assessment. It's I did use the ones that are validated down to about third grade. We don't have things validated for self-report lower than that. We can use it lower than that. Just how reliable it's going to be, we don't know. So assessment is something that can be done. It's done in an anonymous way, because one of the things about psychological measures, and especially self-report measures, is that you can accidentally influence the outcome if it's not anonymous. You might be, inadvertently and completely unconsciously driving the results if it's not done in a way that everybody knows is actually anonymous. I have actually had one school play with it a little bit, and not surprisingly, what you get when you go to schools that emphasize agency is it comes out really positive, because they're doing the job, they're doing the work. But that also is something that if you're having that conversation and it's difficult with parents, if you can say, oh, hey, we did an assessment on whether their needs are actually being satisfied the way we said they are, and look, it is. And actually Village Free School, because that was one of the locations I used, you literally have peer-reviewed published evidence to that fact. It's a little old now, but hey, that's what you gotta do. Okay, so that's one thing. Cult. I think that's a good conversation to have. I'm actually developing a course right now. It's actually a revision of an older course I did, but I'm speaking to the idea of what are the course that is. I'm developing a course, and actually uses cult as an aspect of that conversation. Is to say, the premise, it's called Defense Against the Dark Arts, because the Imperious Curse from Harry Potter is a real thing. It just doesn't work the way Harry Potter portrays it. It is real in the sense that there is stuff that the way that cults work is scientifically predictable, explainable, predictable, and that's what I call, and the subtitle of my first book, my award-winning book, is How to Manage the Hidden Curriculum in K-12. And the hidden curriculum is exactly how cults work, and how schools work. And even your school, no matter what you call it or how you do it, has a hidden curriculum, and it is how that school works. The question is whether that hidden curriculum is working to the beneficial well-being effects of their participants or not. The reason a cult is called a cult and has a negative reputation is because one of the ways that organizations can work is to put the needs of the organization above the well-being of any participant in it. The irony of that is that those organizations have a tendency to kill their leaders eventually. Because an organization does not care about any individual within it, unless it is structured to do so. And when you set up an organization that does not care about its participants, and you are a participant, you have said, this organization does not care about me. That leads to predictable, harmful results for every participant in it. The organization has an existence that emerges from all those individuals. It's not separable from them because it requires individuals to exist, but it can have what we would anthropomorphize as intentions that do not take any account of what their needs of the individuals that make it up are. That's why we can have Jim Jones and his cult that eventually goes and commits suicide and kills him in the process. We can have a Nazi Germany, which he killed himself. He did it himself, and killed a lot of people in the process. Because the way that those organizations are structured is to say that organization does not care about any individual within it, and it acted accordingly. Now we can also look to Mahatma Gandhi's work to say that actually was literally the opposite. He said, we're going to have an organization that literally cares about everybody in it, including the oppressor we are fighting against is included in who we care about. The reason Gandhi was effective was not because he coerced the British out. He changed the situation that the British existed within. He said, his movement said, Indians matter. And the British were like, no, they don't. But the Indians acted in a way, and very cleverly acted in ways, that said, nope, we do, and the world agrees, because media was a key part of what Gandhi achieved. He utilized media very cleverly to ensure that the British ignorance of the well-being of Indians was on full display. So that was the effect. The British didn't leave because they wanted to leave. They left because they were looking around going, this isn't working. And they left. It's of course more complicated than that. But the idea is that what Gandhi was talking about, what his message centrally was everybody matters. And we have to have a politics of everyone mattering. And he worked endlessly to achieve that. It's arguable whether or not that survived after his death. In fact, fairly clearly did not. There may be places where it is true, or organizations that are working in that way, but as a whole, India still has its conflicts and problems. And it wasn't going to go away just because he was always there. Like, it's not a magical thing. He still has to require that message to be essentially focused on and then brought about. But my point is, using those examples, we can think about not just the political and social level, but we can think about the leverage for change really has to come from the focus on the need support. What is the politics of supporting the needs of people in the organization? In organizational change has to focus on that, and then societal change will come about as we get more and more examples of organizations that have taken that seriously. And the examples we have, Je'anna and Sifaan and it sounds like Dileepa. I don't know if we've met, but the democratic schools, the Agile Learning Centers, there's a variety of ways to talk about it. But when you really take agency seriously, what you're doing is saying, the agency of everyone in this organization matters, and we're going to organize accordingly. In the US, that mostly looks like private schools, a few charter schools, because in the mainstream schools, there are those examples of they're doing supportive agency, but because of the dominance of the Basics 1.0, it's hard to maintain that in that system. And that's why we need a clear acknowledgement of that's the leverage point. And that's why I focus on in loco parentis as a legal responsibility of every school, no matter what stripe they are. Just the fact that children are taken care of by someone other than their parent means that in loco parentis is in effect, and we have to say that is what matters. I don't care what else is going on. If you have charge of children, these are your responsibilities, and autonomy is one of them. So if you have a program that can measurably be shown to be diminishing autonomy, you're not living up to your basic adult responsibility for children, independent of educational agendas. You have to be a responsible adult of caring for children. And if you're not doing that, there's something more fundamentally wrong. So I think that's the political leverage that even a mainstream can listen to. The parents are, in Oregon here, parents are legally held responsible for the well-being of their children. One of the ways we do that is that when people have these belief systems that say that medical intervention is not appropriate because of their beliefs, our state says that's not appropriate. And they intervene and legally hold parents accountable for the deaths of children when medical intervention could reasonably be expected to succeed. So literally, state takes responsibility over the parents in that instance, because we can see that well-being was unreasonably compromised. And that's the leverage I think that we can have in the mainstream using a Back to Basics 2.0 that doesn't say that, doesn't come up front and say you're doing a bad thing and you're abusing children. That's not a good conversation to have. Nobody wants to hear that. But we can say, oh, look, there's well-being needs that children have, that we have a school system designed poorly to support that. And every single teacher I've ever met, that I've had the conversation with, I've never met a teacher that didn't care about children. Now, I've had and I've been to conferences all the way to the very mainstream conferences. I've had some people who work in schools say, I've met the person who didn't care about the children, but they're not the ones who go to conferences, so it's not surprising I have a self-selecting pool of people I talk to. But I think vast majority of people in education are there to support children. And when they realize that their autonomy is a fundamental need and it is their responsibility as an adult to support that need, then they're going to have a little self-reflection to say, wait a minute, am I doing a good enough job? And then I have tools to help support them in having that conversation, regardless of what situation they're currently in.